Hello everyone, welcome to Psychology 303, Analysis of Everyday Behavior. And today we're going to combine reinforcement and extinction to talk about differential reinforcement. So, as I just said, differential reinforcement is reinforcing good behavior while at the same time extinguishing bad behavior. This is often used when we want to try to eliminate some kind of behavior that's undesirable, but instead of just doing that, also maybe, and we'll talk about the variations, but also maybe try to replace it with a more desirable behavior to allow individuals to continue to acquire that reinforcer that reinforced the negative behavior, but have it reinforce this alternative behavior. So we're going to be talking about a lot of different types of differential reinforcement, and there are a lot of different acronyms for these. Most of them start with DR. It can be a little bit confusing, but if you just take the time and really kind of section all of these out, it can be fairly straightforward to remember all of these. So probably the most common, most frequently used type of differential reinforcement is DRA, differential reinforcement of an alternative behavior. This is basically what I just described, decreasing that undesirable behavior through extinction while at the same time increasing a more desirable replacement behavior through reinforcement. So if a child cries to get attention, we want to try to extinguish that behavior, but maybe increase or reinforce the behavior of a child coming up and hugging a parent to try and get attention. So again, we've kind of talked about both of these aspects in reinforcement and extinction respectively. And we try to use DRA when the behavior that we're trying to increase, this more desirable behavior, already occurs in the first place. We would need to use some other technique if we're trying to introduce a novel behavior, but we only use DRA if that behavior exists in the first place. So if we want to substitute eating burgers with salad, we would only use DRA if we've eaten salad in the first place, or we have some kind of reason to eat salad. That way we would increase the behavior rather than kind of create a novel behavior out of nothing. And importantly, it's important that you're able to deliver the reinforcer after every occurrence of this new alternative behavior. Again, we talked about in reinforcement, being able to attach a reinforcer so that's contingent on the behavior is key for reinforcement. So the steps are pretty straightforward. Figure out what these desirable and undesirable behaviors are, identify how the desirable behaviors can be reinforced through the same means in which the undesirable behavior is currently being reinforced. So again, you ideally want to use the same reinforcer, whether it be attention or food, etc., etc. And it can sometimes take a little bit of work to figure out exactly how these behaviors are being reinforced. You need to observe the individual, question the individual, and then sometimes, again, using functional assessment and analysis, try and figure out which reinforcers are the strongest for increasing this behavior. So there are different ways we can do this. Through stimulus assessment, we can use single stimulus assessment. That's where we present only one reinforcer to see how effective it is. We can present two reinforcers at the same time so we can see which one is stronger, or multiple different reinforcers to see, all right, out of all of these different reinforcers, which one seems to be the best at increasing the frequency of behavior. So we're thinking about candy. We could present a candy reinforcer to a child one at a time. Here's Skittles, here are Snickers, here's a different one. We could present two different types of candy, see which one the child chooses, or give them a whole different range of options and see which one the child gravitates towards. So that's identifying the reinforcer. That's a very important step, but a step that sometimes it's kind of quickly overlooked as a quick thing to do. You then want to, again, reinforce the desirable behavior, eliminate reinforcement through extinction for the undesirable behavior, slowly shift to intermittent reinforcement of the alternative behavior. Again, we want this to be maintained. We talked about in reinforcement, shifting from continuous to intermittent reinforcement is ideal. And then we also want this to be generalized. So the examples I primarily used there were through positive reinforcement. That's kind of the easiest thing to use as an example. But the differential reinforcement, DRA especially, does also work with negative reinforced behavior. An example would be maybe a child hitting themselves to get out of doing homework or schoolwork, well, you would want to reinforce actually performing the desirable behavior, which would be completing work. The reinforcer we want to try and keep, which is getting out of work. So maybe rather than a child hitting themselves to get out of doing work, well, if you just do a little bit of work, then you can get out of doing more, and we can do that later. So again, trying to keep the same reinforcer for both the desirable and undesirable behaviors, but make sure that the individual knows that this undesirable behavior isn't the ideal way of getting to that reinforcer. Here's a better way. This behavior, doing work, is the better way of getting to that reinforcer. So there are some slight variations of DRA. Rather than focusing on an alternative behavior, we can sometimes shift focus specifically to an incompatible behavior. So that would be an alternative behavior that a person can't do at the same time as the undesirable behavior. So if a child keeps grabbing at food with their hands and throwing it all over the place, the alternative behavior, we could make an incompatible behavior of giving them a spoon and asking them to use a spoon to eat. So they can't grab food with their hands if they also have a spoon in their hand. Another variation would be DRC, differential reinforcement of communication. So rather than a person, or in this case a child, grabbing at food in order to get attention, a child, we may want to reinforce them communicating using words in some way to get attention. Say, hey mommy, look at me. Or if it's food that they want, rather than the child actually going into the cupboards and grabbing food, we encourage the child to shift to a more desirable behavior of asking parents for food. So focusing more on communication aspect of alternative behavior. So DRA is not the only type of differential reinforcement that we can utilize. We can also have differential reinforcement of other behavior. And this terminology is actually very confusing. We're not necessarily reinforcing a different behavior like we would with DRA, but we're actually reinforcing the absence of the undesirable or problem behavior. So with DRO, if we'll take the example of a child sucking their thumb. We want to get rid of that. So we kind of figure out, all right, let's identify a period of time in which if the child doesn't suck their thumb during that period of time, then we give them the reinforcer. So if the child sucked their thumb and say, for example, the parents ended up reading to them more often whenever the child sucked their thumb, then instead we would reinforce the absence of thumb sucking. So if a child sucks their thumb and then within a 10-minute period the child doesn't suck their thumb, the parent would go, all right, good job not sucking your thumb, let's read a book. And as the child performs the behavior less and less, you would extend that interval from 10 minutes to 20 minutes to 30 minutes, and then reinforce those longer and longer periods of time. Again, we're focusing on extinguishing a problem behavior or undesirable behavior, but we're not necessarily reinforcing an alternative behavior as much as we are reinforcing the absence of the undesirable behavior. So a lot of similarities in terms of implementing DRO. We're again making sure we identify the problem behavior and identify what's reinforcing the problem behavior. We want to be sure to choose a time interval ahead of time. It should be tied somewhat to the baseline frequency of how commonly that behavior occurs. So if a child sucks their thumb pretty regularly, you may want to start with shorter intervals, but if it doesn't happen that often but you want to get rid of it completely, then you would start with longer intervals. You want to implement extinction and reinforcement, again, extinguishing the undesirable behavior and reinforcing the absence of the behavior. If the behavior occurs within that set time interval, you then reset the time and start right from the beginning again. You're not going to reinforce the absence of the behavior until that full interval has been passed. And then as the child gets better and better, you want to increase the length of that time interval. One other little wrinkle is the difference between whole interval and momentary DRO. If you're focusing on the absence of a behavior during the entire time, you would want to focus on whole interval, so you don't want it to happen during that entire 10 minutes. But sometimes you're only focused on whether or not the behavior is occurring at the end of the interval. We talked about studying and reinforcement in those terms. So it could be the case where you're only focused on or are only able to observe the individual at the end of the interval. Getting a little tongue-tied here. But generally you want to focus on whole interval DRO. That is the most effective way to extinguish this undesirable behavior. And the last variation of differential reinforcement is differential reinforcement of low rates of responding, or DRL. This type of differential reinforcement is important when you want to reduce a behavior but not eliminate it or extinguish it entirely. So there may be the situation where a child is raising their hand way too much in class, or students raising their hand way too much in class. You don't want to eliminate that behavior entirely. You still want the student to ask questions, but you want them to calm down a bit. Maybe only ask questions when they really don't find things confusing. So in that situation, we would use DRL. How do we do that? Well, there are some variations. In full session DRL, we only reinforce a behavior if less than a certain number of responses have occurred over a period of time. So with the student raising their hand, we would only give them the time of day, only say, all right, what's your question, if the individual has only asked a certain number of questions during the class period. So maybe once they reach 5 questions per class period, we no longer pay attention to them. One important caveat to that is you need to be clear about what that maximum is. That way the individual themselves know that they can only perform this behavior a certain number of times. The other variation is spaced responding DRL. That's when, rather than focusing on the entire time period and how many responses occur within it, we focus on the time in between behaviors. So how long has it been since that student raised their hand to ask a question? It's been 5 minutes. Okay, I'm willing to go ahead and listen to their question. Or, oh, it's only been 30 seconds. No, I'm not going to actually field their question. So you only reinforce the behavior if the interval in between behaviors is sufficient. It's whatever you've decided it to be, whether it be 5 minutes or 10 minutes, etc., etc. So if you think about spaced responding DRL, it may sound quite similar to what we talked about with DRO. We're trying to reinforce the absence of a behavior occurring. It's kind of a weird thing to think about. But there are some important distinctions between the two. So with spaced responding DRL, we're still reinforcing a behavior, but we're reinforcing it after a specific time period has occurred. With DRO, we're reinforcing the absence of the behavior. The reinforcer is delivered when the behavior has not occurred. We're again reinforcing that kind of space in between the behaviors. Another important distinction is, again with DRL, and especially spaced responding DRL, we want to decrease the rate of behavior. We don't want to eliminate it entirely, but with DRO, the idea is to eliminate the behavior, to extinguish that behavior entirely. So in terms of implementing DRL, again, very similar to the other types of differential reinforcement. Figure out what the behavior is, figure out if it's appropriate to use DRL, figure out what the acceptable level of DRL is, whether it's a certain number of responses within a time interval through full session DRL, or what the kind of time interval in between behaviors should be if it's spaced responding DRL. Make sure that the client knows what the criteria are for responding. They know that they only have this certain number of behaviors, or they need to wait this amount of time between behaviors. And then also making sure that the client has feedback on their behaviors. Again, we have to remember that the idea is to not to trick the client, but to make sure that they know how they should be behaving if you truly want them to change their behaviors. So in terms of the differences between each of these differential reinforcements, with DRA, we're reinforcing an alternative behavior, one that already exists. With DRO, we're reinforcing the absence of a behavior. And with DRL, we're reinforcing either a lower rate of responding or an increased interval in between responding, or in between behaviors. And again, with DRL, we're trying to reduce the behavior, not eliminate the behavior entirely. So that's differential reinforcement, a really handy tool combining reinforcement and extinction. That's all I have on the subject. Thank you again for your time and attention, and I will see you all in the next video. Thanks.